Hello everyone, great to have you with us again with our next episode of our Basel 4 channel, which is all around giving you a good update on recent developments related to Basel 4, or what we call Basel 4, being the developments around RWAs and the consultation papers that have been published and are being published or updated by the Basel Committee. As said, it's about Basel 4, those topics that focus on new requirements for RWAs, or changing requirements for RWAs, basically for all risks, but we also cover with the channel related topics. For those that are listening the first time, we've started the Basel 4 channel in March-April 2016. We've had many episodes every month, and we also had two special topics already. The idea of the channel is basically to give you in a 30 minutes, 45 minutes an update on the most recent developments, where we basically give you a summary and we also share with you some of the implications that we see in practice whilst working with banks and whilst discussing with regulators and supervisors. So we decided to do it this way, like a WebEx way, instead of sending you emails or pestering you with all type of other ways or in any other way. By doing this, it's basically you are very free to join. You either join the live session, but you also, since we upload onto YouTube all the recordings of this of the WebExes, you basically are free to send to your colleagues or to anyone else who also wants to join, and you can basically plan for yourself when you want to basically listen to the recorded WebEx on YouTube. And of course, if you have any questions, feel free to ask us. With each episode, you can see the contact details of the presenters. You will have my contact details, or my colleague Martin Nijs, who is also leading this Basel 4 or our Basel 4 initiative. But you also have basically your local Basel 4 contacts in your territory. So feel free to reach out to any of us with questions or comments. For now, the next topic which is on the agenda, as I said before, it's focusing on Basel 4, but also on related topics. And one of the, of course, related topics or related development comes also from the EBA. One of the key topics around Basel 4 is basically the whole discussion around the variability of RWAs that are produced by the use of internal models. So the Basel Committee has published its paper in March 2016 around the scope of use, around estimation practices, and also around the input floors for internal models. But also the EBA is basically taking this topic, as it basically concurs with the fact that there is some variability or significant variability in terms of RWA production. November 2016, which is just some weeks ago, the EBA has published on the 14th of November a consultation paper with guidelines on estimation of PDs and LGDs and on the treatment of default exposures. So the topic for today is basically around this wave, which is presented in guidelines by the European Banking Authority. We will guide you through the guidelines and basically provide you with our view on this quite extended document. Today, our specialists who join me in presenting to you are Kaan and Iosif. I will ask them to introduce themselves quickly and then continue with the presentation to basically give you the latest insights and our views. So Kaan, shall I start with you? If you can introduce yourselves, and Iosif introduce yourselves, and then of course then the floor is yours. Guys?
Good afternoon. we have recently received a very important paper released by EBA, which was expected for a long time, and it is a document that will guide the banks in the near future for the compliance with IRB requirements. Certain areas of unclear conceptual ideas had been through this paper to a large extent clarified, and we have received a strong indication what should be the next steps to improve the PD LGD estimation and how we should treat the defaulted exposures. We have actually in this paper, which we are going to try to summarize today, 6 main topics that will be the main subjects we'll be dwelling upon. First of all, we will talk about the general estimation requirements, the PD and the LGD estimation, how should be the risk parameters basically assessed and calculated for default exposures. Then we will as well talk about the application of risk parameters in the context of IRB risk charge, capital charge calculation, and the final topics will be related to redevelopment, re-estimation, and recalibration, and which triggers should be there in place when we have to decide when we have to redevelop a model, re-estimate the risk parameters, and recalibrate the models. Clearly, for many years, we didn't have such clear guidelines on these topics. For the first topic about general estimation requirements, segmentation obviously is the first important item on the agenda. The main aim is here to provide guidance of the design, of the rating system design, and how should the ratings be at all set up to cover certain asset classes and segments. A rating should cover exposures where the obligors and facilities reflect some commonalities, some common characteristics in terms of creditworthiness, and fundamentally this way should be comparable given data availability for any asset class. Exposures covered by the same rating system should be treating as well the pricing, the credit approval in the same manner. So institutions should have been using them in a more consistent way if they don't want to create fragmentation in the way they apply these models. Data obviously is the fundamental key success factor. Good quality of data will be a primary condition for developing a robust rating system. Institutions are expected in that respect to create and institutionalize internal policies, standards, and procedures for data collection, storage, migration, and actualization. Obviously, there is a need of a process which includes an assessment of the accuracy, completeness, and appropriateness of the data. Human judgment is not left out, although the recent studies conducted by EBA have been providing some negative sentiments towards the human judgment. Is still found in this paper sufficient support for human judgment being involved in the design and development of robust rating systems. To some extent, obviously, human judgment is expected to be involved in order to make sure that the models are appropriate for the foreseeable portfolios and for a given economic condition. Expert judgment may be necessary in that sense, particularly with respect to the verification of several model assumptions whether or not these are in line with expectations, design of the model, and choice of risk drivers. Expert judgment obviously had to be appropriately documented and justified for all models and for all risk parameters. The paper is introducing a very strong concept of margin of conservatism. It's abbreviated as MOC. MOC aims at addressing basically all errors that cannot be easily overcome and rectified through appropriate adjustment, and any other uncertainties related to the estimation of risk parameters can be all accounted under MOC, margin of conservatism. There's a four phases framework which has been described in detail in the technical part of the paper. First of all, the deficiencies had to be identified. For this end, a robust process has to be initiated in the bank, including possibilities to cover all data errors or any uncertainties that might lead to estimation errors for classifying them in these categories. Then it has to be quantified. The quantification of estimation error might prove obviously a very difficult task for some type of models, especially when it comes to low default portfolios. The appropriate adjustment should be applied by financial institutions on their adequate models for correcting errors, and this should be conducted through a process through all models that is providing some parameter estimates for IRB risk charge calculation. Where such appropriate adjustments are used, institutions should apply margin of conservatism to account for the additional estimation error associated with these adjustments. Institutions should also apply a margin of conservatism to address any errors that have not been corrected via appropriate adjustments and any identified uncertainties. The impact of MOC does not ever result or should not ever result in lowering PDs and ALGDs. It should have an increasing effect. In summary, it should be as well possible that the MOC can be implemented in a timely manner through an IT solution by the institution. Therefore, all institutions are expected to consider overall impact of the identified deficiencies and the resulting MOC, a margin of conservatism, on the soundness of the model. Obviously, all these adjustments and the resulting margin of conservatism values should be by model documented and methodologically provided in the manuals that has to be used by the bank, by the institutions. Monitoring is an important topic in that sense that institutions should regularly monitor the level of appropriate adjustments and the margin of conservatism. Adoption of MOC by institutions should not replace the need to address the causes of errors or uncertainties. For the PD estimation, general requirements have been specified, and in that sense, the guideline on PD estimation should provide, among others, more detailed guidance on the calculation of observed default rates, on the estimation of the long-run average default rate. These two important parameter values are to be differentiated from each other. For each of them, there is a certain set of requirements that have been put in place. General requirements specific to a PD are the following items. Institutions should form a reasonably and effective basis for the resulting predictions of their PD models. This should cover exposures where the obligors show common drivers of risk and fundamentally comparable availability of credit-related data and information. Exposures covered by one PD model should be managed homogeneously by institutions in terms of risk management. Clearly, for guarantees and off-balance sheet exposure items, the indication is there that they should be rated as well. In other words, each natural or legal person that has exposure within the scope of IRB should be rated by the institution. Whether the credit has in place an unfunded credit protection or funded credit protection doesn't make a difference. New information, if and when it arrives, should be taken into account with respect to relevant risk drivers and factors, and should be part of rating criteria. If it has not been taken into account in the previous time, it would need to be integrated in due course as soon as possible. For the PD estimation, default date calculation has to be taken care of specifically. Completeness of quantitative and qualitative data should be substantiated. All data relevant for identifying non-default exposures at the beginning of the observation period should be readily available and identified. Exclusions of observations should only be done when the counterparts wrongfully included in the data set of default, or when the counterparts wrongfully assigned to the considered rating model. Clearly, EBA have also observed that in the documentation process, sometimes the model developers have been missing a lot of steps in their descriptions, how they have cleaned the data. So documentation should include all data cleaning procedures in a very accurate and comprehensive way. If and when the data has been, especially default data has been provided by different data sources, there has to be a consistency check applied, and this should be done between the data set driven from different sources. The reference data set, obviously for the purpose of model development, should provide for sound processes, should be provided by sound processes, and the models should be sophisticated to the extent that the data availability substantiate this. To compensate with the certain uncertainties in case of fragmented development samples, or in case of low default portfolio environment, additional margin of conservatism is expected. Representativeness in that sense becomes also a very important topic. Representativeness for the assignment of counterparts and facilities does not require, in that sense, that the proportion of defaulted and non-defaulted exposures in the development data set be equal to the proportion of default and non-default exposures in the bank's respective portfolio. Here, observed default rates has been a discussion point, and for that, the numerator and denominator defined in the paper. The denominator should contain the counterparts of the considered model or calibration segment with any credit obligation at the beginning of the observation period, and the numerator should include all counterparts considered in the denominator with at least one default event during the observation period, 1-year observation period. Under circumstances, the obligors, the counterparts that don't have credit products can be taken away from the sample, and they might be used to form a separate pool in the rating system. Similarly, if and when the committed lines and credits are not drawn, in that case that might be treated as well in a separate pool, as they might blur the difference between default and non-defaulted customers, as they have not been exposed to actual balances. Calculation of the observed average default rate is important. That should be conducted per rating grade and pool, and for the portfolio covered with the according PD model. Or for any other calibration segment. Documentations of considerations for the chosen approach should be available in the model documentation in clear terms. Last but not least, the long-run average default rate and PD estimation methodologies needs to be discussed. A long-run average default rate is important because here the historical observation period should be representative of the likely range of variability, and this is in that sense important that the variability of one-year default rates should be tested within the historical observation period. If there is no downturn period contained within the historical observation period, the long-run average default rate, if it contains a downturn period, the long-run average default rate can or should be equaling to average observed one-year default rate. However, if it does not contain or it does not cover one downturn period within the historical observation period, in that case, estimation might require an appropriate adjustments to take into account that there was no downturn year in the observation period. Benchmarks obviously are also used in this context. To limit likelihood of variability stemming from the application of this concept, the maximum average of one-year period default rates over the most recent 5 years are required if and when there are longer years back in time available as observation periods. This could be used as well, depending which one is generating higher average long-run default rates. Here is obviously inclination towards being more conservative by choosing the long-run average default rate, which is higher depending on the observation period. But minimum time period is again 5 years, as we have already mentioned. For the LGD estimation, data requirements and representativeness tests are already discussed in full detail in this paper, as the LGD estimates should be based generally on the institution's own experience as the paper goes. We think this might cause a big problem for some financial institutions where mostly external data has been used for non-retail or low default portfolio asset classes. Important is here that the paper asks the banks or the institutions to collect all relevant data which needs to be properly recorded and stored, including the important data items of the date of default, all cash flows and events after default, direct or indirect cost information about discount rate, and other transaction relevant details that might be relevant for LGD calculation. For the purpose of representativeness or establishment of representativeness, even if data set is not fully representative for the portfolio in question, it might contain some valuable information, and that doesn't necessarily justify excluding of this data from the estimation process as long as there is a relevance economical or transaction-wise. In case not fully representative date is the question that needs to be addressed, in that case, additional margin of conservatism should be applied in order to address the discrepancy with respect to representativeness. For the LGD estimation, as we might already have been dealing for some years, calculation of economic loss and realized LGD are really the predominant topics that I would be addressing as last item here. Treatment of fees and interest should be consistent according to the paper, and it should be treated in the economic sense of these measures in a similar way. The resulting measure of realized LGD should be consistent with the exposure value that will be used for the purpose of calculation of capital requirements. Additional fees or interest that are capitalized after the moment of default obviously should not increase the outstanding amount at the moment of default, or they should not accrue substantial additional value to the existing absolute value of LGD at the time of default. Discounting rate had been always a topic of I would say, heavy debate. And here, again, we come across some clear indication that the bank should be using interbank funding rates with an add-on. As an add-on, this paper had been proposing to have in place 5%, which might be for some economies a huge, I think, percentage-wise increase. Therefore, it has to be really taken with some serious caution, whatever the paper has been proposing here. Discounting rate does not reflect funding cost according to this paper, so rather it's reflecting the uncertainty inherent in the recovery process. So, in other words, it should be taken both here. We should be taken into account both the time value of money and the uncertainty in the recovery process, usually attached with a risk premium. All direct costs should be considered material in that sense of this paper, whereas in material, indirect costs may be excluded from the calculation. So in short, in the LGD estimation, we have some significant new, let's say, conceptual ideas that has taken root along this paper, and my colleague Iosif will be taking on from here on.
So now we'll move on to the estimation methodologies for the development of our LGD estimates and the treatment of collateral. So in fact, actually, the draft EBA guidelines do not prescribe any specific methodology that should be used in estimation LGD. But that being said, the EBA does outline several general principles for LGD estimation. So firstly, what has been specified is the types of potential risk drivers that should be taken into account by institutions. And these include the typical factors that you would normally expect in LGD models, such as, for example, factors related to the transaction, so type of product, type of collateral, LTV factor, and factors related to the borrower, like size or the type of the business of the borrower, but it also now includes factors related to the institution itself. So this means in particular that the specifics of the recovery process of the institution has to be taken into account. And in addition, external factors such as legal frameworks must be taken into account. And this is especially important when the LGD models are applied in many different countries for multinational banks. And in addition, it has been clarified that these risk drivers should not be only analyzed at the moment of default, but also at least within a year before default. And to do this properly, reference dates for the assessment of factors should be chosen by the banks. And these reference dates should be representatives of the values of given risk drivers within a year before default, taking into account the volatility of these factors. For the treatment of collaterals in LGD estimation, in terms of eligibility of collaterals, it has been clarified that institutions may in fact take into account any type of collateral, as long as they have established for them requirements in terms of collateral management, legal certainty, and the risk management standards that are consistent with those set out in the CRR. Since the existence of collateral significantly influences recoveries, at least the main types of collaterals should be considered relevant and included in LGD estimates. But the exact methodology for the inclusion of collaterals in LGD estimates is not really specified. That being said, some guidelines are given, and in particular, the EBA is paying attention to avoiding bias in LGD estimates that may stem from inappropriate treatment of cash flows realized from collaterals, as well as from inappropriate valuation of collaterals. And finally, for collaterals, in terms of cash flows included in the LGD estimation, it has been clarified that recoveries from collateral should be included regardless of the form of the realization of the collateral. So this has to include both sales of collateral but by the obligor itself, sales resulting from court procedures, and as well things like repossessions of collateral by the bank in exchange for reducing the credit obligation. In the case that the bank repossesses the collateral, additional haircuts must be established as the difference between the market value and the value of the repossession. and these haircuts must be back-tested. The draft guidelines also clarify how long-run average LGD should be calculated. So firstly, the historical observation period for long-run average LGD estimation should contain data from various periods with different economic circumstances. And these differing economic circumstances refer not only to the time of default, but also to the time when cash flows are actually collected as part of the recovery process. So it has to include different economic conditions for the recovery process. And since recoveries are largely driven by the institution's own processes, a lot of emphasis has to be given to internal data as opposed to external data. And this means that all available internal data should be considered relevant and taken into account. And the estimation sample for long-run average LGD should be largely based on available closed internal recovery cases. So this is opposed to current models, which are often in a large part based on external estimates. The guidelines also specify that the calculation of long-run average LGD should be an arithmetic average of realized LGDs, but it should be weighted by the number of defaults. And there might be some exceptions for retail exposures, so more weight can be sometimes given to more recent data, but the justification for this should be clearly documented. Additionally, there's been some clarification with respect to treatment of incomplete recoveries. So if you look at the CRR, according to the CRR, the long-run average LGD has to take into account all observed defaults. And this means that the calculation should also include incomplete recoveries, because although they're incomplete yet, they're also coming from defaulted cases. So in order to obtain a realistic value of long-run average LGD, these incomplete recoveries should be included in the estimation. But the way they should be included is with future recoveries that are expected to be realized from them. And the values of these future recoveries have to be estimated based on the actual observed closed cases. Finally, it has been clarified that no negative LGDs are allowed at the level of individual observations. So when the calculation of realized LGD results in a negative number, it should be floored at 0. With respect to downturn adjustment, which is quite important for LGD estimates, no specific guidance has been given yet. The BA mentions that in a separate RTS, it will clarify what constitutes a downturn period, but at the same time, for now, it does not actually plan to clarify how to actually incorporate the downturn adjustments into LGD estimates. So next, we will cover briefly risk parameters for defaulted exposures. So the guidelines pay particular attention to the estimation of LGD in default and best estimate of expected losses for defaulted exposures. And to avoid inconsistencies and large jumps in LGD rates at the moment of default, it is generally expected by the EBA that the same estimation requirements that are used for defaulted exposures will be used for non-defaulted ones as well. But there are specific exceptions which are mentioned in the paper. So for data requirements, similar to non-defaulted exposures, emphasis is given to the institution's own internal experience. All relevant information obtained during the recovery process should be taken into account. And what this really means is that factor values after the default event must be stored, and not only factor values before the default event and analyzed. And this should be done for all relevant factors, including those that only become potentially relevant after the default event occurs. Reference dates are another topic covered by the draft guidelines. So the difference between LGD in default and best estimate of expected loss, the ELBE, is used to derive a risk weight. And what's important to note is that to obtain a risk-weighted exposure amount, this risk weight should be multiplied by the current exposure amount after default, and not the exposure at the time when the loan defaulted. And this means that basically institutions should set up reference dates after the default event, after which, at which point realized LGD values would be computed. Another important aspect clarified concerns the treatment of incomplete recovery processes for the purpose of calculation of long-run average LGD in default. These have to be excluded from the calculation according to PBA. And finally, the guidelines reiterate again that risk drivers must be analyzed not only until the moment of default, but also at the date of default and until the date of actual termination of the recovery process. And this has to include risk drivers that potentially become relevant only after the date of default. The draft guidelines also provide some additional specific requirements for estimation of ELBE, best estimate of expected loss, and LGD in default. So for ELBE estimation, it is noted that margin of conservatism should be excluded. And this is understandable because the role of this parameter is to be a best estimate of losses and not a conservative estimate of losses. That being said, ELBE estimates should be appropriate for current economic circumstances. In order to accomplish this, institutions should take into account macroeconomic factors relevant for the type of exposures under consideration. So at the end, ELBE estimates are obtained by taking a long-run average LGD for defaulted exposures and applying an adjustment that depends on the current economic circumstances. And where the realized LGD for defaulted exposures is not sensitive to economic factors, the LBE should be calculated on the basis of the long-run average LGD. LGD in default, on the other hand, should reflect downturn conditions. The EBA does not specify exactly how it should be computed, but regardless of the way this parameter is estimated, financial institutions should be able to document and explain separately the different components that it's breaking into. So it should be able to document the breakdown of the LGD in default into its two main components, ELBE and an add-on. And further, it should be able to provide documentation of the breakdown of the add-on into its own components. So the component that estimates downturn conditions, the margin of conservatism add-on, which has to be included in LGD in default, and any other additional add-ons that cover for potential additional unexpected losses during the recovery period. So the next topic covered by the EBA is the application of risk parameters. And here there are two subtopics, conservatism and human judgment. So we already discussed previously, briefly, the topic of margin of conservatism. And what we mentioned is that it needs to be added due to weaknesses in the model development process. What's important to note is that in addition to weaknesses in the model development process, the guidelines specify that conservatism should also be applied when there are weaknesses in the way the models are actually implemented and used in the bank. And to do this properly, institutions should set up a framework that consists of four main phases. So the first phase is identification of deficiencies in the implementation and the use of models. So for these purposes, EBA provides some triggers that could lead to conservatism, such as, for example, missing data in the current portfolio, missing updates of financial statements for non-retail exposures, or missing or stale ratings. And when one or more triggers occur, institutions should ensure that the estimate becomes more conservative. The second phase is specification of the form of conservatism to be applied, and the actual calculation of the level of conservatism. The third phase is monitoring. So institutions should continue to monitor the deficiencies in the way the models are applied, and the way and the levels of conservative add-ons that are applied due to these deficiencies. And the final phase is documentation. So institutions should have clear manuals and procedures in place for applying conservatism due to deficiencies in the way models are implemented and used. Next, for the application of risk parameters, the BA clarifies how human judgment should be applied. Obviously, it is expected that human judgment is used in risk parameter estimation. This could be done both in the qualitative factors of the models, as overrides in the inputs of the model, and as overrides to model outputs. What is important to note is that when human judgment is used, a structured framework should be set up, which includes clear policies and criteria for the use of overrides, specification of limits to overrides, a predefined list of justification for overrides, documentation of overrides, and monitoring of overrides. And additionally, the goal really is improvement of the model. So institutions would be expected to assess the predictive power of the models before and after the inclusion of overrides. And it would be expected that adding overrides would add to the predictive power of the models. And finally, the last topic covered by the paper is additional guidance related to redevelopment, re-estimation, and recalibration of models. So what the ABA provides us a list of triggers that should be used, so minimum trigger sources, which should be used for banks to understand when models should be redeveloped. And as well, the ABA clarifies what institutions should consider in their internal frameworks for annual reviews, the minimum scope of analysis that institutions should conduct during their annual reviews, and the ABA asks institutions to set up cycles of fundamental reviews of models, depending on the materiality of the models considered. These reviews should contain an update of the development data sets and the re-estimation of all the modeling components.
Well, in conclusion of all these topics, we do believe that individually all this additional guidance and additional requirements might clarify a lot of open-ended questions we had in matters of model development and parameter estimation on the one side. On the other side, it might also pose a significant risk for many banks, especially when they have more than 20 models. They might need to start quite soon with the relevant work, as the preparation might take for some banks to institutionalize more than a year or two, depending on the existing process and model documentation. And we do believe that the sooner the banks start with the preparation, the better it will be. The paper is the first consultancy paper. It's quite likely that we will have a second one down the road in the next year's time, but it might become also fundamentally it will become legal obligation for financial institutions starting from 1st January 2021 onwards. So there are some time available to the finance industry here. However, one needs to be having very strong project management skills and should start working on these topics with the new year.